The darkness of a late summer night in Hendersonville, Tennessee, usually offers a reprieve from the humidity that clings to the suburbs north of Nashville. It is a quiet community, the kind of place where manicured lawns and brick facades suggest stability and order. On the night of the 10th of August 2012, that silence was shattered not by the noise of an intruder breaking in, but by the roar of an inferno consuming a family home from the inside out. The residents on the 100 block of Tyree Drive became the epicenter of a frantic emergency response as orange flames licked up the sides of the structure and black smoke billowed into the starless sky. To the neighbors watching from their porches, clutching robes and phones, it appeared to be a tragic accident, a household catastrophe that wakes families in the dead of night. They did not yet know that the fire was merely a curtain, a chaotic final act intended to conceal a violence far more personal and calculated than a stray spark. Inside the burning house, the situation was a waking nightmare for Josh Davis. The older of the two Davis brothers, Josh had been asleep in his bedroom when the acrid smell of smoke pulled him from unconsciousness. Disoriented and coughing, he realized the hallway was impassable. The heat was already intense, a physical wall barring him from the rest of the house. His first instinct, cutting through the panic, was to reach his mother, Melanie Davis. He called out to her, but the crackling of the fire and the groaning of the structure were the only responses. The door to her room was shut. When he tried to navigate the hallway, the intensity of the flames forced him back. Survival instinct took over. Josh scrambled to his window, forcing it open, and tumbling out into the night air. Gasping and terrified, he ran to the neighbors, screaming for help, screaming that his mother and his younger brother, Zachary, were still inside. The Hendersonville Fire Department arrived within minutes, their sirens cutting through the heavy air. Firefighters deployed hoses, battling the blaze that had engulfed significant portions of the single-story home. They moved with the urgency of men knowing there were lives unaccounted for. Josh, soot-stained and shaking, watched as they kicked in doors and smashed windows to vent the smoke. The team made entry, navigating the superheated air and the debris of a life being incinerated. They swept the rooms, looking for the 49-year-old mother and the 15-year-old son. In the master bedroom, they found Melanie. She was lying on her bed. She was not moving. The firefighters extracted her from the room, hoping against the odds for a resuscitation, but it was immediately clear that Melanie Davis was beyond medical aid. As the flames were beaten down and the smoke began to clear, the nature of the tragedy shifted. Fire investigators and police officers began their preliminary assessment of the scene. What they found in the master bedroom did not align with a death caused solely by smoke inhalation or thermal burns. The patterns of injury on Melanie Davis were inconsistent with the fire. There was severe trauma to her head, catastrophic injuries that suggested blunt force impact delivered with tremendous power. The fire had damaged her body, but it had not killed her. The medical examiner's initial observations would later confirm that Melanie had died from skull fractures and brain injuries before the fire ever touched her. The weapon was not a falling beam or collapsing debris. It was a sledgehammer. The discovery transformed the site from a fire rescue operation into a homicide investigation. The immediate question became the whereabouts of 15-year-old Zachary Davis. He had not exited the house with Josh. He was not found in the wreckage during the primary sweep. Fear that the boy was lost in the fire or had been abducted by whoever killed his mother gripped the surviving family members. Police established a perimeter, expanding their search into the surrounding neighborhood. They did not have to look far. Zachary was found shortly after the fire was extinguished, alive and physically unharmed. He was located at a nearby recreation center, casually walking, holding a notebook. His demeanor stood in stark contrast to the chaos unfolding down the street. He was not crying. He was not frantic. He was eerily composed. Officers approached the teenager, cautious but needing answers. When asked about the fire, about his mother, and about his escape, Zachary's responses were flat. He did not ask if his mother had survived. He did not ask about his brother. The detachment was palpable, unsettling even the veteran officers on the scene. They brought him in for questioning, separating him from the trauma of the scene to ascertain what he knew. It was in the sterile environment of the interrogation room that the narrative of a tragic accident fully collapsed. Zachary Davis did not deny his involvement. He did not invent a story about an intruder in a ski mask. He admitted to striking his mother with a sledgehammer while she slept. He admitted to pouring gasoline on her bed. He admitted to lighting the match. The confession was disturbing not just for its content, but for its delivery. Zachary spoke of the events with a clinical detachment, as if recounting a mundane chore. He told detectives that he had waited until his mother fell asleep. He described retrieving the sledgehammer. He detailed the mechanics of the assault, the number of strikes, and the sound of the impacts. He explained that, after killing his mother, he set the fire to destroy the evidence and to kill his older brother, Josh, who was sleeping down the hall. When asked why, Zachary offered an explanation that steered the investigation toward the realm of psychological breaks. He claimed that voices in his head told him to do it. He spoke of auditory hallucinations, a compulsion driven by external commands that he could not resist. He painted a picture of a mind under siege, acting out the will of unseen forces. For a brief moment, the case appeared to be a clear-cut tragedy of untreated mental illness, a psychotic break resulting in matricide. However, the investigation was far from over. Detectives needed to corroborate the voice's narrative. They turned their attention to the physical evidence collected from the boy and the scene. The notebook Zachary had been carrying when he was found became a critical piece of the puzzle. It was not a diary of a frightened child hearing voices. It was a repository of dark musings. Among the scribbles and notes, one phrase stood out, written in a steady hand. "You can't spell slaughter without laughter." The line, a macabre play on words, often found in dark internet subcultures, suggested a level of irony and self-awareness that contradicted the chaotic narrative of a psychotic break. It was a glimpse into a mindset that found humor in violence, a chilling marker of a personality that engaged with death as a concept to be trifled with. The true dismantling of the insanity defense, however, began when forensic investigators turned their attention to the family computer. In 2012, the digital footprint of a teenager was often a window into their unvarnished self, a record of curiosities and obsessions that were hidden from parents and teachers. The Hendersonville Police Department's Cybercrimes Unit imaged the hard drive from the Davis home, expecting perhaps to find video games or social media interactions. What they found instead was a roadmap to murder. The browser history was a catalog of depravity, a systematic course of study in death and suffering. In the weeks and days leading up to the murder of Melanie Davis, the user of that computer had not been searching for help with mental health. There were no searches for hearing voices, schizophrenia symptoms, or how to stop bad thoughts. Instead, the search queries were methodical and predatory. The history revealed extensive searches for serial killers, delving into the biographies of history's most notorious murderers. There were searches regarding torture devices, specifically looking for methods to inflict pain. Most damning of all were the searches that directly mirrored the crime scene. The user had looked up information on how to kill someone with a sledgehammer. They had researched the flammability of household items and how to start a house fire that would ensure total destruction. This digital evidence fundamentally shifted the trajectory of the prosecution. The Voice's defense relies on the premise that the defendant could not appreciate the nature or wrongfulness of their actions due to a severe mental disease or defect. It implies a lack of control, a chaotic impulse. The search history, however, screamed of premeditation. It showed a timeline of planning. Zachary Davis had not snapped in a moment of madness. He had studied. He had weighed his options. He had selected a weapon, researched its efficacy, and planned a method of disposal for the body and the home. The fire was not an afterthought. It was a researched contingency. The use of the sledgehammer was not a crime of opportunity. It was a chosen method of execution. The juxtaposition of the brutal, messy crime scene with the cold, digital planning created a portrait of a distinct type of offender. The notebook provided the emotional context, the callousness, the dark humor, while the computer provided the operational timeline. Prosecutors began to assemble a case that would argue Zachary Davis was not a victim of his own mind, but a budding psychopath who had decided to experiment with murder. The victim, Melanie, was his mother, a woman who had raised him, yet she had been reduced to a subject of this experiment. The target, his brother Josh, was collateral damage in a plan to wipe the slate clean. As the community of Hendersonville grappled with the shock, the legal system geared up for a battle over the mind of a 15-year-old. The defense would inevitably cling to the narrative of mental illness, bringing in experts to testify about his affect, his upbringing, and his psychological state. But the prosecution now had the ammunition to counter every claim of insanity with a time-stamped log of preparation. The searches for serial killers were not academic, they were aspirational. The searches for torture were not idle curiosity. They were a rehearsal. The investigation also delved into the days immediately preceding the murder to see if there were warning signs the family had missed. Interviews with teachers and peers painted a picture of a boy who was quiet, perhaps a bit withdrawn, but not outwardly violent. There were no records of fights at school, no long history of animal cruelty that often heralds such violence. This lack of external red flags made the digital revelation even more jarring. The violence had been internal, cultivated in the silence of his bedroom, illuminated only by the glow of the computer monitor. The voices he claimed to hear were likely not hallucinations, but the internal monologue of a boy desensitizing himself to the act he was about to commit. When the autopsy report was finalized, it confirmed the brutality that the search history had foreshadowed. Melanie Davis had been struck multiple times. The force required to fracture the skull with a sledgehammer is immense. It is not an act that can be performed tentatively. It requires a commitment to the swing. The medical examiner's findings underscored the viciousness of the attack, noting that the blows were concentrated on the head, intended to kill instantly and surely. There were no defensive wounds to suggest she had woken up or fought back. She had been sleeping, vulnerable and safe in her own bed. When her son stood over her with the heavy tool he had retrieved for this specific purpose. The timeline established by the police placed Zachary in the house for a period after the murder, but before the fire was fully set. He did not flee immediately in a panic. He took the time to spread the accelerant. He took the time to ensure the fire would take hold. This window of time, this pause between the murder and the arson, further eroded the claim of a sudden psychotic break. It demonstrated a presence of mind, an adherence to the plan he had researched. He was executing a checklist. As the case moved toward the preliminary hearings, the notebook phrase, "You can't spell slaughter without laughter," circulated through the media, becoming the defining epitaph of the crime. It stripped away the sympathy usually afforded to juvenile offenders. It suggested that somewhere behind the blank stare and the monotone voice, there was a person who found amusement in the concept of butchery. The prosecution prepared to present this not just as a murder, but as a calculated thrill kill masked by a clumsy attempt at an insanity plea. The intro to the legal proceedings was set. A boy who claimed he heard voices against a mountain of data, proving he had simply been doing his homework on how to get away with murder. The tragedy of the Davis family had ended in fire, but the legal examination of Zachary Davis was just beginning, promising to shine a light into the darkest corners of a disturbed adolescent mind. The prosecution prepared to systematically dismantle the narrative of a helpless, hallucinating child. To do this, they turned away from the grisly crime scene photographs and toward the digital footprint Zachary Davis had left behind. The investigation into his electronic devices transformed the case from a tragedy of mental illness into a study of cold, calculated execution. Forensic analysts extracted data from the family's iPad, a device shared by the household but dominated by Zachary in the weeks leading up to the murder. What they found was not the chaotic browsing of a mind under siege by auditory hallucinations, but the methodical research of a student preparing for a final exam. The timeline of the web searches provided a chilling counter-narrative to Zachary's claims of sudden, overwhelming voices. Investigators found that long before the sledgehammer was lifted, Zachary was seeking information on the mechanics of death. The search history revealed a sustained interest in violence that was specific and practical. He had not merely stumbled across violent content, he had actively sought it out. The queries included terms related to serial killers, specifically those who had engaged in torture and dismemberment. This was not the random curiosity of a teenager, but a focused study on the suffering of others. Crucially, the digital forensics uncovered searches for Sean Vincent Gillis, a Louisiana serial killer known for mutilating his victims. This detail became a cornerstone of the state's theory. It suggested that Zachary was looking for role models or templates for his behavior. He was not inventing a scenario based on the commands of invisible entities. He was researching historical precedents. The prosecution noted that auditory hallucinations, as described in clinical schizophrenia, typically manifest as intrusive, confusing, and distressing commands. They rarely instruct a sufferer to open a web browser and research specific historical figures or efficient killing methods weeks in advance. The digital evidence showed planning, curiosity, and a desire to understand the logistics of murder. Further analysis of the device showed that Zachary had researched methods to silence a person and how to inflict pain without immediate death. This directly contradicted the defense's potential argument that the killing was a mercy or an impulsive act to stop the voices. The searches indicated a desire to control the experience of the victim. The prosecutors pieced together a timeline where Zachary's digital life became a rehearsal space. He was simulating the crime in his mind, using the internet to fill in the gaps of his knowledge. This period of research constituted the legal definition of premeditation. It required time, reflection, and judgment faculties that the insanity defense argued he did not possess at the time of the crime. While the digital evidence built the intellectual framework of the murder, the physical evidence found in his bedroom provided the emotional context. The notebook, containing the infamous "slaughter without laughter" phrase, was subjected to intense scrutiny. Handwriting experts and psychological profilers examined the journal to understand the mindset of the author. The notebook did not contain the frantic scribbles of a person in psychosis. The writing was controlled. The sketches, though dark, were deliberate. The prosecutors argued that the notebook was a manifesto of sorts, a place where Zachary cultivated a persona of darkness. It was an accessory to his fantasy, a prop he used to bolster his self-image as a dangerous entity. The phrase itself was analyzed not just as a witty quip, but as an indicator of his detachment. To find humor in the word slaughter required a cognitive distance from the reality of violence. It suggested that Zachary viewed the act of killing as a game or a linguistic puzzle rather than a moral atrocity. This emotional blunting was a double-edged sword for the defense. While they could argue it was a symptom of schizoaffective disorder or schizophrenia, the prosecution framed it as psychopathy, a personality disorder characterized by a lack of empathy and remorse, which does not absolve a defendant of criminal responsibility. As the evidentiary picture solidified, the legal proceedings shifted to the critical issue of jurisdiction. The state moved to have Zachary tried as an adult. This was a pivotal moment in the build-up to the trial. In juvenile court, the maximum penalty Zachary could face would keep him in custody only until his 19th birthday, a mere 4 years for the bludgeoning of his mother and the attempted murder of his brother. The district attorney argued that the severity of the crime, coupled with the sophisticated level of planning revealed by the iPad searches, demanded adult consequences. During the transfer hearing, the court heard testimony regarding Zachary's competency and the nature of the offense. The judge was presented with the reality of the crime, the multiple blows with the sledgehammer, the subsequent arson, and the calm demeanor Zachary displayed to the arriving officers. The prosecution highlighted that Zachary had not only killed his mother, but had locked the doors and set the house on fire to ensure his older brother, Josh, would also die. This secondary target proved that the violence was not solely directed at the source of his alleged frustration, his mother, but was a broader attempt to eliminate his entire family. The intent to kill Josh, who was asleep and defenseless, required a level of strategic thinking that was incompatible with a sudden psychotic break. The judge ruled in favor of the state. Zachary Davis would stand trial as an adult. This decision dramatically altered the stakes. He was no longer facing a few years in a rehabilitation center. He was facing life in prison without the possibility of parole. The transfer to adult court also meant that the trial would be a public spectacle, open to the media and the community of Hendersonville, who were still reeling from the brutality of the event. The ruling stripped Zachary of the protections afforded to children and placed him squarely in the arena of adult criminal liability. Following the transfer, the battleground shifted to the psychiatric evaluations. The defense enlisted Dr. William Burnett, a forensic psychiatrist, to evaluate Zachary. Burnett's preliminary findings leaned heavily toward a diagnosis of schizophrenia. He took Zachary's reports of hearing voices at face value. Zachary described the voices as distinct entities, sometimes male, sometimes female, telling him that he was worthless or commanding him to hurt others. He claimed that on the night of the murder, the voices had become unbearable, and killing his mother was the only way to silence them. The prosecution viewed these reports with extreme skepticism. They prepared to counter Dr. Burnett with their own experts, and more importantly, with the discrepancies in Zachary's own behavior. They noted that Zachary had never mentioned voices to his friends, teachers, or family prior to the murder. There was no history of prodromal symptoms, the early warning signs of schizophrenia, such as a decline in hygiene, social withdrawal, or disorganized speech, that typically precede a violent psychotic break. Zachary had been functioning relatively normally. He attended school, interacted with peers, and navigated the complex social hierarchy of high school without raising alarms. The state's team began to formulate a theory of malingering. They believed Zachary was exaggerating or entirely fabricating his symptoms to avoid prison. They scrutinized the recordings of his police interrogation. In the hours immediately following the murder, Zachary had been calm, articulate, and oriented. He knew the date, the time, and his location. He explained his actions with a chilling rationality, stating that his mother was disappointed in him and that he felt he wasn't meeting her expectations. He did not speak of demons or hallucinations until later in the process. The voices narrative, the prosecution suspected, was a convenient shield adopted after the gravity of his situation became clear. The build-up to the trial also involved the painful preparation of the surviving victim, Josh Davis. Josh was not only the brother of the defendant, but the son of the victim. He occupied a unique and tragic position in the case. He had to prepare to testify against his younger brother, detailing the events of that night and the dynamics of their household. Investigators interviewed Josh extensively to construct a profile of Zachary's domestic behavior. Josh described a brother who was quiet and withdrawn, but not manifestly insane. There were no stories of Zachary talking to empty rooms or screaming at unseen assailants. Josh's recollections reinforced the state's timeline. Zachary was a simmering pot of resentment, not a chaotic vessel of psychosis. As the trial date approached, the prosecution refined their opening statement. They would present Zachary not as a monster created by biology, but as a narcissist created by his own choices. They planned to use the "slaughter without laughter" quote as the thematic anchor of their case. It would serve as the lens through which the jury would view every other piece of evidence. When the jury saw the autopsy photos, the prosecution wanted them to remember that Zachary found amusement in the concept. When they heard the 911 call, they wanted them to recall that Zachary had researched how to silence a victim. The defense, conversely, prepared to dive deep into the medical nuances of mental illness. They gathered academic literature on the early onset of schizophrenia in adolescence. They prepared to argue that the search history was a manifestation of the illness, a sick mind seeking understanding of its own dark urges. They would claim that the planning was not rational premeditation, but the delusion-driven logic of a psychotic break. They aimed to humanize Zachary, to portray him as a victim of his own biology, trapped in a nightmare he didn't choose. Both sides understood that the outcome would hinge on the jury's interpretation of the voices. If the jury believed the voices were real, Zachary might spend his life in a hospital. If they believed the voices were a lie, he would die in prison. The search history and the notebook were the weights on the scale. The prosecution was confident that the specificity of the Google searches would outweigh the vague descriptions of auditory hallucinations. They were ready to prove that Zachary Davis did not kill because he lost his mind, but because he had made up his mind. The investigation was closed, the motions were filed, and the stage was set for a trial that would explore the darkest corners of the human psyche. The legal arguments regarding Zachary Davis's mental state would eventually consume the courtroom, but to understand the validity of those claims, one must examine the raw, chronological mechanics of the night in question. The events of the 10th of August 2012, at the Davis residence on Tyree Drive in Hendersonville, Tennessee, did not unfold with the chaotic frenzy of a sudden psychotic break, but rather with a methodical, chilling pace that belied the defense's later narrative of irresistible impulse. The evening began in a mundane fashion. Melanie Davis, a 53-year-old mother who worked hard to support her two sons, had finished her day. The summer air was heavy, and the suburban neighborhood was settling into the quiet rhythm of a Friday night. Inside the home, the atmosphere appeared normal. Melanie's older son, Josh, was in his room upstairs. Zachary, then 15 years old, was awake, occupying his time in the way many teenagers did, though his internal monologue was allegedly dominated by the auditory hallucinations he would later ascribe to a persona named Bob. At approximately 11 p.m., Melanie Davis decided to retire for the night. She said goodnight to her son, unaware that these would be the final words she would ever exchange with him. She went to her bedroom, changed into her sleepwear, and climbed into bed. Within a short time, she drifted into a deep sleep, exhausted from the week. The house fell silent, save for the hum of the air conditioning and the ambient noises of the settling structure. Zachary Davis remained awake. According to the timeline reconstructed by investigators, he did not act immediately upon his mother going to bed. He waited. This period of waiting would later become a critical point of contention, suggesting a window where he had the capacity to contemplate his actions. During this time, he was not pacing frantically or screaming at unseen specters. He was quiet. He eventually moved from his space and navigated through the darkened house to the garage. In the garage, Zachary located a sledgehammer. It was a heavy, long-handled tool, intended for demolition and construction, not a weapon of convenience like a kitchen knife or a heavy lamp. The selection of this specific tool required him to leave the main living area, enter the garage, retrieve the item, and return. He carried the sledgehammer back into the house, moving through the hallways with practiced stealth. The weight of the hammer in the hands of a 15-year-old required two-handed control, a physical reality that would necessitate deliberate force to wield. He approached his mother's bedroom door. It was closed, or perhaps slightly ajar, but he pushed it open silently. Inside, Melanie was asleep, completely defenseless, and unaware of the figure standing over her. The room was dark, likely illuminated only by streetlights filtering through the blinds or the faint glow of electronics. Zachary positioned himself by the bed. He raised the sledgehammer. The violence that followed was extreme and immediate. Zachary brought the sledgehammer down on his mother's head. The first blow was devastating, shattering the skull and rendering Melanie instantly incapacitated. However, he did not stop. The forensic evidence indicated multiple strikes. This was not a single lash-out in a moment of blinded panic. It was a sustained assault. He continued to bludgeon her until he was certain she was no longer breathing. The brutality of the act stood in stark contrast to the silence of the house. The sound of the impacts would have been sickeningly loud in the confines of the bedroom, yet the walls insulated the noise enough that Josh, sleeping elsewhere in the house, did not immediately wake. Once the physical act of murder was complete, Zachary did not flee the scene in horror. He did not call 911 inches a state of realization. Instead, he placed the sledgehammer aside and began the second phase of his plan. He exited his mother's bedroom and closed the door, sealing the carnage away from the rest of the house. His attention then turned to his older brother, Josh. The plan, as later revealed through investigation, was not limited to matricide. Zachary intended to eliminate the entire family unit. He moved to the kitchen and gathered combustible materials. He found a lighter and matches. He did not attempt to confront Josh directly with the hammer, perhaps calculating that his older brother would be able to overpower him. Instead, he chose fire. Zachary began setting fires in the house. He ignited a trash can. He lit wet towels and other fabrics, attempting to create a blaze that would consume the structure and trap his brother upstairs. The logic was cold. Kill the mother with force, kill the brother with fire, and destroy the evidence of the first crime with the second. He moved through the ground floor, nurturing the flames, watching as the smoke began to curl up toward the ceiling and fill the hallways. The smell of smoke eventually drifted upstairs. Josh Davis woke up, not to the sound of violence, but to the acrid scent of burning material. Confused and alarmed, he got out of bed and moved to the landing. He saw the smoke billowing from the lower level. His first instinct was that of any resident facing an accidental fire panic and a need to escape. He ran downstairs, coughing, his eyes stinging from the fumes. As Josh reached the ground floor, he encountered Zachary. The 15-year-old was not frantically trying to put out the fire, nor was he screaming for help. He was simply there. When Josh, in a state of high adrenaline, asked what was happening, the reality of the situation began to fracture. The fire was obviously not an accident. Josh quickly realized the danger was not just the flames, but his brother. Josh managed to navigate the chaos and realized his mother was not accounting for herself. He went to her bedroom door. When he opened it, the horror of the night was fully revealed. The condition of Melanie Davis was such that it was immediately apparent no medical intervention could save her. The juxtaposition of the bloody crime scene in the bedroom and the growing fire in the hallway created a nightmarish scenario. Josh retreated and dialed 911. His voice on the recording captured the sheer terror of the realization. He reported that his brother had killed their mother and set the house on fire. While Josh was frantic, pleading for help, and fearing for his own life, Zachary remained disturbingly detached. He did not try to stop Josh from calling the police. He did not attack Josh again. He simply waited. When Hendersonville police officers arrived, they found a chaotic scene. Fire trucks were en route, sirens cutting through the night. The officers approached the house, weapons drawn, unsure if they were walking into an active shooter situation or a hostage crisis. They found Josh outside, distraught. Inside, or near the entrance, they encountered Zachary. The behavior of the teenager at the scene became a focal point for the responding officers. Amidst the flashing lights, the smoke pouring from the residence, and the hysterical grief of his brother, Zachary Davis was calm. He was not crying. He was not shaking. He was not covered in sweat or showing signs of a struggle. He surrendered without resistance. Officers handcuffed him and placed him in the back of a patrol car. Inside the vehicle, while technicians worked to extinguish the fire and preserve the crime scene, Zachary's demeanor remained flat. He did not ask about his mother's condition. He knew it. He did not ask if his brother had made it out safely. He sat quietly. One officer later noted that Zachary appeared more interested in the mechanics of the police cruiser than the tragedy that had just unfolded. Investigators moving through the house found the physical evidence that would anchor the prosecution's case. The sledgehammer was recovered, covered in blood and tissue, a silent testament to the ferocity of the attack. The burn patterns on the floor and the charred remains of the trash can confirm the arson was deliberate, with multiple points of origin. It wasn't a fire that started from a knocked-over candle. It was a fire started with intent. In the bedroom, the medical examiner's initial assessment confirmed the brutality. Melanie had suffered massive cranial trauma. The angle and force of the blows suggested she had been struck while lying down, offering no defensive wounds. She had never raised a hand to stop him because she never saw it coming. The trust inherent in a mother sleeping in a house with her children had been the very vulnerability Zachary exploited. As the police processed the scene, they also found Zachary's notebook. It was not hidden away in a safe, but accessible. Inside, amidst typical teenage scrawlings, lay the darker writings that hinted at a fascination with violence. The phrase, "You can't spell slaughter without laughter," was found, a chilling maximize that suggested a delight or at least a dark irony regarding death. This wasn't just a physical crime scene, it was a psychological one. Zachary was transported to the police station for interrogation. The transition from the crime scene to the sterile interview room did not change his affect. He sat in the chair, a small figure in a room designed to extract truths. When detectives began their questioning, they expected resistance, denial, or perhaps a breakdown. Instead, they received a confession that was as clinical as the act itself. He described the events clearly. He admitted to taking the sledgehammer. He admitted to striking his mother. When asked why, he didn't initially scream about demons or elaborate conspiracies. He spoke of voices, yes, but he also spoke of the act with a degree of precision that unsettled the detectives. He explained the fire. He explained that he wanted to kill Josh too. There was no empathy in his tone. He described the murder of his mother not as a tragedy, but as a task he had completed. The most disturbing aspect for the investigators was the lack of motive in the traditional sense. There had been no massive argument that night. Melanie hadn't grounded him or taken away his electronics immediately prior to the attack. The trigger seemed to be entirely internal, yet the execution was entirely external and physical. He had searched for information on serial killers. He had looked up torture devices. These digital footprints, combined with the physical actions of the night, the selection of the hammer, the stealthy approach, the secondary arson attempt painted a picture of a boy who had been rehearsing this scenario in his mind long before he lifted the weapon. Back at the house on Tyree Drive, the coroner removed Melanie Davis's body. The fire damage was contained, but the home was effectively destroyed as a living space, tainted by the violence that had occurred within. The neighborhood woke up to yellow tape and news vans. The reality of what had happened, a son bludgeoning his mother to death while she slept, shattered the suburban peace. The crime was complete. Zachary Davis had successfully executed the primary target of his aggression. He had failed to kill his brother only because the smoke acted as an alarm. He was in custody, the weapon was secured, and the confession was recorded. The physical timeline was indisputable. What remained was the interpretation of the mind that orchestrated it, but the cold facts of the murder itself, the silence, the waiting, the hammer, and the fire stood as a monolith of evidence that would prove difficult to explain away as mere delusion. The voices may have provided the suggestion, but Zachary Davis had provided the hands, the planning, and the lethal force. The first responders on the scene at the Davis residence in Hendersonville faced a chaotic tableau of fire and blood. While the flames had been the primary distress call, the true nature of the emergency revealed itself the moment firefighters and police officers breached the interior. The smoke, thick and acrid, had done little to mask the carnage in the master bedroom. Investigators moving through the waterlogged hallway found the body of Melanie Davis. It was immediately apparent that her death was not a casualty of the fire. The trauma to her head was catastrophic, inconsistent with falling debris or thermal injuries. Detective James Vaughn and the forensic team from the Hendersonville Police Department took control of the site, marking it as a homicide scene. The layout of the house told a disturbing story of targeted violence. The fire had been set intentionally, but it appeared to be a secondary act, a clumsy attempt to destroy evidence or perhaps, as investigators would later theorize, a mechanism to trap the remaining occupant, Josh Davis. The older brother had escaped, his coughing fit saving his life, but Melanie had never made it out of bed. Near the point of origin of the fire, investigators located a crucial piece of physical evidence, a sledgehammer. It was heavy, industrial, and stained with biological matter. The weapon had not been hidden with any great care, suggesting that the perpetrator either wanted it found or had abandoned it in a panic. However, panic did not seem to be the operating emotion of the primary suspect. Zachary Davis, 15 years old, was located nearby. He was not hysterical. He was not grieving. He stood with an unnatural stillness that unnerved the officers who approached him. There were no tears for his mother, no frantic questions about the condition of his brother. He was taken into custody and transported to the Hendersonville police station for interrogation. It was in the sterile, fluorescent-lit interview room that the investigation pivoted from a whodunit to a complex probe into the mind of a juvenile killer. Zachary waived his rights. He did not ask for a lawyer. He sat in the chair, small for his age, and began to speak with a monotone cadence that detectives found deeply result. He admitted to the killing almost immediately. There was no cat-and-mouse game, no denial. He told them he had waited until his mother fell asleep. He described retrieving the sledgehammer. He described striking her. The details he provided were granular and devoid of empathy. He explained that he had hit her approximately 20 times. When asked why, Zachary introduced the first layer of his defense, claiming that a voice he called Magnum had instructed him to do it. He spoke of auditory hallucinations and a dark impulse that he could not control. To an untrained observer, this might have appeared to be a clear case of psychosis, a sudden break from reality that resulted in tragedy. However, seasoned investigators looked for corroboration, and what they found in the physical and digital evidence began to dismantle the narrative of a sudden psychotic break. While Zachary spoke of voices in the interview room, forensic technicians were dismantling his digital life back at the house. They seized a laptop and several notebooks from his bedroom. The contents of these items would become the linchpin of the prosecution's case against the insanity defense. Upon bypassing the passwords, digital forensic experts accessed the browser history. It was a catalog of death. The search terms were not random. They were methodical and specific. Investigators found searches for serial killers, torture devices, and how to get away with murder. There were queries about the mechanics of killing, specifically involving blunt force trauma. This was not the chaotic browsing of a confused mind, but the research of someone planning an execution. The timestamps on these searches dated back weeks, directly contradicting the idea that the murder was a spontaneous impulse driven by a sudden hallucination. He had been studying. He had been preparing. The physical search of his bedroom yielded equally damning results. In a spiral-bound notebook, amidst mundane schoolwork and doodles, detectives found handwritten passages that chilled them. One phrase, written in clear block letters, stood out. "You can't spell slaughter without laughter." It was a macabre play on words, a slogan often associated with internet shock culture and dark fictional characters, but here, written by a boy who had just bludgeoned his mother, it read as a manifesto of cruelty. Other pages contained violent sketches and musings on death, further cementing the image of a teenager who had been nurturing a deep-seated fascination with violence long before he picked up the hammer. The autopsy report arrived on the desk of the lead investigator, providing the final biological confirmation of the suspect's account. The medical examiner confirmed that Melanie Davis had died from severe craniocerebral injuries due to multiple blows with a heavy object. The pattern of the wounds indicated she was likely asleep or incapacitated when the first blow landed, as there were minimal defensive wounds on her arms or hands. She had not had the chance to fight back. The brutality was excessive. The number of strikes went far beyond what was necessary to kill, indicating a level of rage or detachment that aligned with the overkill often seen in intimate family homicides. Back in the interrogation room, the disconnect between Zachary's claims and the emerging evidence grew wider. He told detectives that he didn't feel anything while committing the act. He described the sensation of killing his mother as merely something that had to be done. When the topic of his brother Josh arose, Zachary admitted that the fire was intended to kill him too. He had closed the door to Josh's room and set the fire outside it, hoping the smoke would incapacitate him. The survival of his brother was a miscalculation, not an act of mercy. Investigators also interviewed neighbors and school acquaintances to build a psychological profile. They learned that Zachary was quiet, often withdrawn, but few had seen signs of the monster revealed by the evidence. There were no reports of violent outbursts at school, no long record of animal cruelty that often serves as a precursor to human violence. He was a cipher, a boy who lived a double life, one as a quiet suburban teenager and another as a budding predator consuming violent content in the privacy of his room. The digital forensics team dug deeper into the timeline. They correlated the search history with the days leading up to the murder. On the night of the killing, the browser history showed activity that ceased only shortly before the attack. He had been feeding his mind with images and stories of death right up until the moment he decided to make them real. The voices he claimed to hear were noticeably absent from his digital footprint. He hadn't searched for help with hallucinations or symptoms of schizophrenia. He had searched for ways to kill. The district attorney's office, upon reviewing the mounting pile of evidence, made the decision to seek adult charges. The Tennessee law allowed for juveniles to be transferred to adult court for serious crimes, and the premeditation indicated by the search history and the notebook removed any hesitation. This was not a child who made a mistake. This was a calculated assassination. The slaughter without laughter note became a focal point for the prosecution's strategy. It suggested a level of sophisticated, albeit twisted, cognition that belied the simple insanity plea. As the investigation wrapped up, the pieces of the puzzle formed a terrifying picture. Zachary Davis had not snapped. He had slowly, methodically worked his way up to the murder. The sledgehammer was not a weapon of opportunity, but a chosen instrument. The fire was a secondary cleansing, a way to remove the witnesses. The confession, while seemingly cooperative, was stripped of remorse. He described the events like one might describe a movie plot. The final report from the investigators detailed a cold-blooded matricide. They noted that after the murder, Zachary did not flee into the woods or try to harm himself. He lingered, watching the house burn, watching the result of his research. When police arrived, he was ready to tell his story, but he thought he could control the narrative with the voices defense. He hadn't counted on the digital breadcrumbs he left behind. The search history, indelible and precise, became the silent witness that would eventually ensure he never walked free again. The investigation concluded with Zachary Davis charged with first-degree murder and aggravated arson, the weight of his own internet searches pressing down the scales of justice against him. The community of Hendersonville was left to grapple with the reality that the most dangerous threat to the Davis family had been the quiet 15-year-old boy living in the bedroom down the hall. The search history extracted from the 15-year-old's iPod Touch and the family computer provided investigators with a chronological map of his intentions, effectively dismantling the narrative of a sudden psychotic break. Forensic computer analysts retrieved data that Zachary Davis had attempted to delete, revealing a pattern of obsession that long predated the violence of that August night. In the weeks leading up to the murder, the device had been used to access a disturbing curriculum of death. The browser history did not show a mind seeking help for auditory hallucinations or mental distress. Instead, it showed a student of homicide conducting research. The keywords were specific, clinical, and practical. He had searched for information on serial killers, focusing not just on their crimes, but on their methods and their notoriety. Among the most damaging pieces of digital evidence was a sustained interest in Sean Sellers, an Oklahoma teenager who had famously murdered his parents and a convenience store clerk in the 1980s. Sellers had claimed satanic possession and ritualistic motivations, a detail that resonated ominously with Davis's own claims of hearing voices. Prosecutors later argued that Davis was not suffering from the same delusions as Sellers, but was instead studying him as a precedent, looking for a blueprint on how to commit matricide and what legal defenses might be viable for a juvenile offender. The digital footprint suggested that Davis was shopping for a persona, eventually settling on the tortured soul narrative to mask a cold-blooded calculation. Further analysis of the web activity revealed queries regarding the durability of the human skull and the efficacy of various blunt instruments. He had looked up information on sledgehammers, specifically the mechanics of swinging them, and the damage they could inflict. This direct correlation between the search terms and the murder weapon found at the scene a 20-pound sledgehammer taken from the garage removed any ambiguity about the weapon's selection. It was not a crime of opportunity where the killer grabbed the nearest object in a frenzy. The evidence showed that he had identified the sledgehammer as the most efficient tool for his purpose days in advance. The digital forensics also uncovered searches related to the penal code and juvenile sentencing guidelines, indicating that he was weighing the consequences of his actions against the satisfaction of carrying them out. Complementing the digital trail was a physical artifact that offered an even darker glimpse into Davis's psyche, a spiral-bound notebook recovered from his bedroom. This journal became a centerpiece of the state's evidence, serving as a written confession of his worldview. In handwriting that remained steady and legible, Davis had penned violent fantasies and disturbingly callous aphorisms. The most infamous entry, which was later projected onto screens in the courtroom, read, "You can't spell slaughter without laughter." This phrase, borrowed from dark pop culture corners, was not the rambling of a confused child, but the gloating of someone who found amusement in the concept of lethal violence. The notebook contained no entries detailing the struggle against voices or expressions of fear regarding his mental state. Instead, it documented a growing misanthropy and a desire to inflict pain. The investigation into the fire provided another layer of forensic proof that countered the insanity defense. Arson investigators determined that the fire had been set with distinct tactical intent. Burn patterns and the presence of accelerants indicated that the fire was not merely an attempt to destroy evidence or a chaotic afterthought. The gasoline had been poured specifically to block the exit path of his older brother Josh. The points of origin were located at the top of the stairs and outside Josh's bedroom door. This evidence proved that the assault on his mother was only the first phase of a binary objective. The meticulous placement of the fire demonstrated a cognitive capacity to plan, anticipate human behavior, and execute a strategy to maximize casualties. A person in the throes of a disorganized psychotic episode typically lacks the executive function required to trap a specific victim while simultaneously managing the destruction of a crime scene. Forensic pathology reports on Melanie Davis corroborated the brutality suggested by the search history. The autopsy revealed that she had been struck at least 20 times. The medical examiner noted the severity of the cranial injuries, which were inconsistent with a single reactive blow one might expect from a frightened child lashing out. The overkill nature of the assault indicated rage and persistence. The angle and force of the blows aligned with the mechanics of the sledgehammer Davis had researched. Furthermore, the lack of defensive wounds on the victim suggested she was taken completely by surprise, likely while asleep or resting, which matched the premeditated nature of a planned execution rather than a spontaneous argument gone wrong. During the subsequent interviews, the consistency of Davis's story was tested against this mounting pile of physical and digital evidence. Investigators noted that while Davis claimed voices commanded him, he could not provide a consistent description of these auditory hallucinations until pressed. His descriptions often mirrored tropes found in horror movies or the very true crime cases he had researched. He spoke of a deep, demonic voice, yet his behavioral evidence told a different story. In the interrogation room, hidden cameras captured his demeanor when he thought he was unobserved. He was not catatonic or weeping. He appeared calm, occasionally bored, and even amused. At one point, he was observed checking his reflection and fixing his hair, a display of vanity that struck investigators as incongruous with a person who had just been compelled by demons to bludgeon his mother. The prosecution's psychiatric experts utilized the evidence to construct a profile of malingering. They pointed to the Sean Sellers searches as the smoking gun of fabrication. If Davis were truly hearing voices, the research into another teen killer who used a similar defense was too convenient to be coincidental. The experts argued that the evidence showed Davis had reverse-engineered his crime. He decided to kill, selected the weapon, researched the method, planned the entrapment of his brother, and then curated a defense strategy based on historical legal precedents he had studied online. The notebook provided the motive, a deep-seated narcissistic rage and a lack of empathy, rather than a break from reality. Additionally, the evidence regarding the timeline of the night itself contradicted his claims of sudden compulsion. Davis had waited until the house was quiet. He had prepared the gasoline beforehand. He had closed the door to his room to shield himself from the initial noise. These were the actions of a predator lying in wait. The arson investigation showed that he had taken time to spread the accelerant carefully to ensure the fire would take hold, a process that requires patience and steady hands. When he eventually exited the house to watch it burn, he had his phone with him, another calculated move. He didn't call 911 immediately in a panic. He waited. The call logs and cell tower data placed him outside the burning home for a significant duration before first responders were notified, not by him, but by neighbors or the escape of his brother. The synthesis of the browser history, the journal, the arson report, and the autopsy results created an insurmountable wall of facts, each piece of evidence locked together to form a picture of a young man who was bored with his life and fascinated by death. The voices were exposed as a fictional construct, a shield made of lies designed to protect him from the consequences of his research. The courtroom presentation of the evidence focused heavily on the juxtaposition between the chaos of the crime scene and the cold orderliness of his preparations. The jury was shown the charred remains of the home and the graphic autopsy photos, and then immediately shown the sterile, typed list of search terms: sledgehammer, kill, insanity defense. This contrast highlighted the reality that the violence was not an external force acting upon Zachary Davis, but an internal desire he had cultivated and fed with information until it was ready to be unleashed. The slaughter without laughter, quote, resonated as the tagline for the prosecution's case, a glimpse into the true motive that no amount of feigned psychosis could obscure. The evidence did not just prove he did it, it proved he enjoyed the planning, the execution, and the subsequent attempt to manipulate the legal system. The digital breadcrumbs he thought would be lost in the fire or overlooked in the chaos instead survived to testify against him, turning his own curiosity and arrogance into the instruments of his conviction. The quote reverberated through the Sumner County Criminal Court, marking the psychological pivot point of the trial. While the physical evidence of the sledgehammer and the gasoline firmly established the mechanics of the death of Melanie Davis, the notebook and the digital footprint established the mechanics of Zachary Davis's mind. The defense, led by attorney Randy Lucas, faced the monumental task of convincing a jury that the 15-year-old boy sitting at the defendant's table, now 18 by the time of trial in 2015, was not a cold-blooded calculator of matricide, but a victim of severe mental illness who had lost his grip on reality. The core of the legal battle shifted immediately to the sanity defense. In Tennessee, the burden of proof for an insanity plea requires the defense to show by clear and convincing evidence that, at the time of the acts, the defendant was suffering from a severe mental disease or defect that rendered him unable to appreciate the nature or wrongfulness of his conduct. It was a high bar, one that the defense attempted to clear by introducing testimony regarding Zachary's alleged hallucinations. They argued that Zachary was not driving the violence, but rather was being steered by a voice he called Magdalene. Dr. James Walker, a neuropsychologist called by the defense, took the stand to provide a clinical framework for Zachary's actions. Walker testified that Zachary suffered from schizophrenia and that his flat affect, the chilling lack of emotion he displayed in police interviews and throughout the trial, was a symptom of his condition, not proof of sociopathy. Walker described a young man besieged by auditory hallucinations, specifically the voice of a little girl who commanded him to kill. According to the defense narrative, the brutal bludgeoning was not an act of hatred or strategic elimination, but a compulsion born of a fractured psyche. To the defense, the chaotic nature of the attack and the subsequent arson were acts of a boy in the throes of a psychotic break, unable to distinguish moral right from wrong. However, the prosecution, led by District Attorney Ray Whitley, was prepared to dismantle the insanity narrative by using the very tools Zachary had used to prepare for the murder. They called their own expert, Dr. Rokeya Farouk, who had evaluated Zachary at the Middle Tennessee Mental Health Institute. Her testimony stood in stark contrast to Walker's. She told the jury that during her extensive evaluations, Zachary did not consistently exhibit the signs of schizophrenia that would absolve him of legal responsibility. Instead, she pointed toward a diagnosis of a conduct disorder with schizotypal personality traits, conditions that entail antisocial behavior and a detachment from social norms, but do not sever the legal tether of accountability. The courtroom dynamic hinged on the timeline of Zachary's internet activity. The prosecution argued that a person in the midst of a spontaneous psychotic break does not spend weeks researching the specific legal mechanisms that would allow them to escape punishment for that break. This was where the search history became the prosecution's most lethal weapon. Jurors were presented with a timeline showing that prior to the murder, Zachary had not only searched for methods of killing and torture devices, but had explicitly researched the insanity defense itself. Prosecutors posited that Zachary was malingering, a clinical term for feigning or exaggerating the symptoms of a mental illness for external gain in this case, avoiding a life sentence. The search logs revealed a curiosity not about how to stop the voices, but about how serial killers operated and how the legal system adjudicated murder. The state argued that Zachary was studying the script of insanity so he could perform it later. When he told detectives about the voices, the prosecution contended he was merely reciting lines he had prepared. The notebook quote about slaughter and laughter was painted not as the rambling of a madman, but as the dark creative writing of a budding sadist who found amusement in the concept of violence. Cross-examination further eroded the defense's position. The prosecution highlighted Zachary's behavior immediately following the murder. After striking his mother roughly 20 times with the sledgehammer and setting the house ablaze, he locked the doors to trap his older brother Josh inside. He then fled the scene, discarded the weapon, and attempted to hide. These were described to the jury as consciousness of guilt. A person who does not understand the wrongfulness of their act rarely takes complex steps to conceal it or evade capture. The locking of the doors, specifically, demonstrated a cognitive understanding of cause and effect. Fire kills, and locked doors prevent escape. It was a calculated attempt to eliminate the only other witness and surviving family member. The jury also heard the audio of Zachary's confession to the police, recorded shortly after his capture. In the recording, his voice was steady, devoid of panic or confusion. He recounted the events with the dry precision of someone reading a grocery list. He admitted to striking his mother while she slept, detailing the sound of the impacts. When asked why he did not stop, he simply stated she wouldn't die. This lack of remorse, combined with the digital evidence of premeditation, created a portrait of an individual who was terrifyingly sane. The state submitted that his flat affect was not a symptom of schizophrenia, but a manifestation of his total lack of empathy. Closing arguments crystallized the two opposing views. The defense pleaded for mercy and medical intervention, portraying Zachary as a sick child failed by his own mind. The prosecution, conversely, pointed to the sledgehammer and the iPad. They reminded the jury that Zachary had told friends at school he was going to kill his mother, statements that were dismissed as teenage bravado at the time, but now looked like a statement of intent. They argued that Magdalene was a convenient fiction invented by a boy who had researched how to get away with murder. The state's narrative was simple. Zachary Davis wanted his mother dead, he wanted his brother dead, and he wanted to be famous for it, all while planning a legal exit strategy via a false insanity claim. The deliberations were relatively short given the gravity of the charges. The jury, comprised of 12 citizens of Sumner County, had to weigh the nebulous nature of psychiatric testimony against the hard, time-stamped evidence of the search history. In the end, the digital trail proved insurmountable. On the count of first-degree premeditated murder, the jury returned a verdict of guilty. They also found him guilty of 2 counts of aggravated arson and the attempted first-degree murder of his brother Josh. The insanity defense had failed completely. The verdict indicated that the jury believed beyond a reasonable doubt that Zachary acted with intent and premeditation, fully aware of the consequences of his actions. The sentencing phase brought a new wave of gravity to the proceedings. Because Zachary was a juvenile at the time of the crime, the death penalty was not on the table, but the state sought the maximum possible punishment, life imprisonment, plus consecutive sentences for the additional crimes. The court heard victim impact statements, though the family was undeniably shattered, with the victim being the mother and the perpetrator being the son. The tragedy was insular. There was no external family to direct anger toward, only an internal void where Melanie Davis used to be. Judge D. David Gay, who presided over the trial, did not mince words during the sentencing hearing. Having sat through days of graphic evidence and dispassionate testimony from the defendant, Judge Gay offered a searing assessment of Zachary Davis's character. He referenced the "Slaughter Without Laughter" notebook entry, citing it as a window into a depraved soul. He noted the chilling calmness with which Zachary had described the destruction of his family. Judge Gay explicitly addressed the dangers Zachary posed to the public. He stated that in his many years on the bench, he had rarely encountered an individual who frightened him as much as Zachary Davis. The judge highlighted the deception involved the methodical research into the insanity defense as proof of a sophisticated and manipulative mind. To the court, Zachary was not a victim of voices. He was a predator who had attempted to game the justice system. The sentence handed down was absolute. Zachary Davis was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Melanie Davis. In Tennessee, a life sentence for first-degree murder requires a minimum of 51 years served before eligibility for parole. However, Judge Gay went further. To ensure that Zachary would likely never walk free, the judge sentenced him to an additional 20 years for the attempted murder of his brother and the arson charges, ordering these sentences to run consecutively, one after the other rather than concurrently. This effectively meant Zachary would need to serve over 70 years before even being considered for release, a virtual life sentence without the possibility of parole. The legal process did not end immediately with the bang of the gavel. As is standard in first-degree murder convictions, particularly those involving rejected insanity pleas, appeals were filed. The defense argued that the trial court had erred in various technical rulings and that the evidence of insanity should have outweighed the evidence of premeditation. They contended that the jury had been swayed by the gruesome nature of the crime rather than the medical reality of the defendant's condition. The Tennessee Court of Criminal Appeals reviewed the case. They examined the trial record, the admissibility of the search history, and the sufficiency of the evidence regarding Zachary's sanity. In their analysis, the appellate judges found that the state had provided ample evidence to rebut the presumption of insanity. The search terms regarding insanity defense and serial killers were deemed highly relevant and properly admitted, as they directly addressed the defendant's state of mind and intent. The appellate court affirmed the conviction and the sentence. The legal outcome of the Zachary Davis case established a grim precedent regarding the admissibility of digital consciousness. The court had effectively ruled that a defendant's search history could serve as a window into their sanity, capable of overriding expert psychiatric testimony. The searches proved that the plan to kill Melanie Davis was not a sudden command from a hallucinated voice, but a project that had been researched, refined, and executed with cold precision. Zachary remained incarcerated, his legal avenues exhausted. The judicial system had concluded that the boy who wrote about slaughter and laughter was not a helpless vessel for Magdalene, but a distinct and dangerous architect of his own violence. The combination of the notebook's nihilistic poetry and the browser history's calculated inquiries had sealed the doors of the prison just as effectively as he had sealed the doors of his burning home. The voices he claimed to hear were silenced in the eyes of the law, replaced by the silent, irrefutable testimony of his own digital footprints. The judicial system had concluded that Zachary Davis was not a helpless vessel for auditory hallucinations, but a distinct architect of his own violence. With the gavel's final strike, the immediate legal battle ended, yet the reverberations of the case began a longer, quieter migration into the history of Tennessee criminal law and the shattered memories of a Hendersonville family. The legacy of the Davis family tragedy is not defined solely by the brutality of a sledgehammer or the flames that licked the ceiling of a suburban home, but by the total annihilation of a domestic unit and the chilling precedent set regarding the digital premeditation of juvenile offenders. At the center of this devastation stood Josh Davis, the older brother who narrowly escaped the inferno meant to consume him. The crime did not merely remove a mother from the equation, it effectively erased the entire immediate family structure. The Davis family had already weathered significant sorrow before that August night in 2012. 5 years prior, the boy's father, Chris Davis, had succumbed to amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or Lou Gehrig's disease. His death had left Melanie Davis as the sole anchor for her 2 sons, a widow navigating the complexities of single parenthood while grieving her husband. When Zachary murdered Melanie and was subsequently removed from society by the state, Josh was left standing alone in the wreckage. He became the sole survivor of a family of 4, having lost his father to illness, his mother to murder, and his brother to the prison system. Josh's role in the trial had been pivotal, yet his life following the verdict became a testament to endurance in the face of betrayal. He had taken the stand to describe the terrifying moments of waking up to smoke and the realization that his brother had locked the doors to trap him inside. The legacy of that night for Josh was a permanent severance of fraternal bonds. There was no reconciliation to be had, no misunderstanding to clear up. The testimony he provided helped cement the timeline that prosecutors used to dismantle Zachary's insanity plea, but it also placed Josh in the impossible position of condemning his only living relative to ensure justice for his mother. The survival of the older brother served as the counter-narrative to Zachary's nihilism. Where Zachary sought total destruction, Josh represented the persistence of life, carrying the burden of the family name forward without the parents or sibling who wants to find it. Beyond the personal toll on the surviving brother, the case left a permanent mark on the legal landscape regarding the admissibility and weight of digital evidence in juvenile insanity cases. The prosecution's strategy relied heavily on the premise that a search engine history is a more honest reflection of the human mind than a psychiatric evaluation. By presenting Zachary's searches ranging from specific torture methods to biographical details of serial killers, the state successfully argued that curiosity and obsession can bleed into intent. This approach effectively modernized the standard for proving premeditation. It demonstrated that in the digital age, the planning phase of a murder often occurs in the quiet glow of a computer screen long before a weapon is lifted. The legacy of this legal strategy serves as a warning and a precedent. The private inquiries made in the solitude of a bedroom are permanent records that can and will be used to distinguish between madness and malice. The physical notebook recovered from the scene, containing the phrase, "You can't spell slaughter without laughter," transcended its role as mere evidence to become a grim cultural artifact of the crime. This single sentence encapsulated the chilling detachment that defined Zachary's legacy. It stripped away the potential for public sympathy, often afforded to 15-year-old defendants. Had the crime been an impulsive act of rage, the community might have viewed Zachary as a troubled child pushed too far. However, the notebook, combined with the digital footprint, painted a portrait of a budding psychopath who viewed violence as a source of amusement rather than a desperate compulsion. This phrase has been repeatedly cited in analyses of the case, serving as the definitive answer to the question of Zachary's remorse. It remains the epitaph of his adolescence, a slogan that ensured his transition from a boy in need of help to a convict in need of containment. For the community of Hendersonville, the legacy of the murder was tied to the physical space where it occurred. The house on the quiet street, once a standard marker of suburban stability, became a void. The fire set by Zachary had damaged the structure, but the stigma of matricide inflicted a deeper structural ruin. Neighborhoods rely on the unspoken assumption of safety behind closed doors. The Davis case shattered that illusion, reminding the community that the most dangerous threats often originate from within the home, not from external intruders. The site became a place of uneasy memory, where the violent end of a neighbor overshadowed years of ordinary existence. The silence that fell over the property mirrored the silence Melanie Davis was forced into, a stark contrast to the chaotic noise of the trial and the media coverage. Melanie Davis herself risks becoming a footnote in the story of her own death, a common phenomenon in true crime narratives where the perpetrator's psychology eclipses the victim's humanity. However, the legacy of the case requires a deliberate effort to remember her, not just as a body found in a bedroom, but as the final barrier between her son and his darker impulses. Friends and family remembered Melanie as a devoted mother who was deeply concerned about Zachary's behavior in the months leading up to the attack. She had sought help, recognizing that her son was drifting into dangerous waters. Her death was not a failure of parenting, but the tragic result of a parent realizing too late that the threat was existential. In the years since the murder, those who knew Melanie have tried to preserve the memory of her resilience as a widow and her dedication to her children, fighting against the narrative that reduces her solely to the victim of a sledgehammer attack. The sentence handed down to Zachary Davis, life in prison, plus additional years for the attempted murder of his brother, solidified the state's rejection of his narrative. Life imprisonment for a juvenile is a contentious issue in the American legal system, often debated on the grounds of brain development and the capacity for rehabilitation. In this case, the severity of the sentence reflected the absolute nature of the evidence. The judicial system determined that the danger Zachary posed was not a temporary phase of adolescence, but a fundamental aspect of his character. His legacy within the Tennessee Department of Correction is one of cold calculation. He entered the system not as a chaotic youth, but as a prisoner who had methodically researched how to kill and executed that plan with precision. As the years pass, the shock of the crime settles into the historical record. The sensational details, the sledgehammer, the fire, the notebook lose their immediate visceral impact and become data points in the study of parricide. Yet, the distinct lack of motive remains the most haunting aspect of the legacy. Unlike cases driven by abuse, financial greed, or sudden passion, Zachary's actions were driven by a terrifying curiosity and a desire to manifest the violent fantasies he had curated online. He killed because he wanted to, and he researched how to do it effectively. This causeless malice makes the case a perennial subject of study for criminologists and psychologists who continue to look at the Davis murder as a clear example of how digital consumption can feed and shape latent homicidal tendencies in the youth. The fire that Zachary lit was intended to destroy evidence and eliminate his brother, a final act of cleansing that would leave him as the sole survivor and narrator of the event. He failed in that objective. The fire was extinguished, the evidence was preserved, and his brother survived to speak the truth. Consequently, Zachary's legacy is one of failure. He failed to kill his brother. He failed to deceive the police. He failed to convince the jury of his insanity, and he failed to erase the truth of what he had done. He remains in custody, a man who grew up within concrete walls, defined entirely by the choices he made at 15. The timeline of the Davis family effectively ends with Josh. The generational continuity was severed by the murder. There are no parents to grow old, no family gatherings that include the brother who is locked away. The legacy is one of absence, the absence of Melanie at graduations and weddings, the absence of a relationship between brothers, and the absence of the future that Chris and Melanie Davis had worked to build for their sons. What remains is the legal precedent, the cautionary tale of the search history, and the enduring memory of a woman who loved a son that was meticulously planning her demise. Ultimately, the case underscores the fragility of domestic safety in the face of untreated or unrecognizable psychopathy. It forces a reevaluation of how society monitors the digital lives of young people and the seriousness with which dark fascinations should be treated. The search terms found on Zachary's computer were not idle curiosities, they were a roadmap. The legacy of the Zachary Davis case is a stark reminder that when a mind turns toward darkness, the warning signs often appear in the silent text of a search bar long before they manifest in physical violence. The tragedy is that for Melanie Davis, the realization of this truth came only in her final moments, leaving the rest of the world to analyze the data points left behind in the wake of her destruction. The house is gone, the family is broken, and the record stands as a permanent testament to the lethality of a meticulously planned betrayal.